Once disembarked, travellers entered the cheerful maelstrom of the boat train platform, and a melee of baggages from Claridge's and the Savoy, Thomas Cook's men meeting anxious American clients, and even a film unit on location. Then it was onto the boat train for a swift, comfortable run up to London and Waterloo Station's Platform 11, the beginning and end of so many millions of transatlantic passengers.
The Norway doesn't have promenade decks in the old sense. Instead, it has two shopping avenues, Champs-Élysées on this side, and on the other side, on the port side, Fifth Avenue. Our grandparents who were passengers would have been astonished at this because don't forget that less than 50 years ago, passengers on ships bought their souvenirs from the ship's barber and improvised their own entertainment of an evening. Steamship historians tend to like the good old days, but I see this as a vast improvement and applaud NCL's decision to make this ship a self-contained resort. What's happened is that the vessel we're on is no longer just merely a means of transportation. It's a floating resort as well. But then it doesn't surprise me that this is successful because I've always believed that the best islands in the Caribbean have propellers anyway. I will be discussing the design of ships' public rooms in this program, and nothing could be more appropriate than to introduce it from the Club International. Here is all the glamour of the past, whether it was, as it was on the France, a first-class smoking room, or reminiscent of dozens of vaulted, majestic interiors from any number of North Atlantic predecessors. Every ship needs a room of this kind, and it is one of the design omissions of the second Queen Elizabeth that there is nowhere a room late at night to have a drink in such splendid surroundings. Surely this is what ocean travel is all about. Impeccable service, unobtrusive good taste, a double-height ceiling, and potted palms that on the North Atlantic would have swayed and trembled with the weather outside. It was a look, moreover, at which the French excelled, as we shall see.
It was the Compagnie Générale Transatlantique, or French line, that put the first post-war ship in service. She was the Ile-de-France, about the size of the Titanic, at 46,000 tons, and from the outside a conventional vessel. The French never built identical trios of ships, but enlarged their flagships by about 10,000 tons, as soon as expansion in their home port of Le Havre allowed greater tonnage. Here are two consecutive French ships, the Paris of 1916 and the larger Ile-de-France of 1927. Similar, but very different inside. The Ile made her maiden voyage in the summer of 1927, and once in New York, after a welcome by the Department of Sanitation band playing from the cutter Macomb, attracted hordes of visitors anxious to see her new public rooms. This was her Grand Salon, which, although fairly tame by present-day standards, was the last word in 1927. Up to that time, it had been popular practice for steamship public rooms to duplicate period rooms elsewhere. The George Washington's first-class smoking room, for instance, built within a year of the Ile, had the look of an Adirondack hunting lodge. On the France of 1912, there was an attempt at a formal chateau. The Mauritania's first-class dining room was a Tudor marble 3 stories high, while on the Paris, Art Nouveau prevailed. But the Ile-de-France's lounge was something quite new, very much by design. Jean Dalpiaz, who headed the French line at the time the Ile-de-France was to be decorated, had set the watchword. Vivre, ce n'est pas copier, c'est créer. To live is not to copy, but to create. So every shred of fabric, every grill, capital, railing, motif, and curlicue on the Ile was perforce created arbitrarily from scratch. Of course, those with a knowing eye noted a direct influence from the Salon des Arts Décoratifs of Paris of 1925, first evidence of the geometrical neo-Egyptian design that would surface full force in the 30s and be called for short Art Deco. Hence, the Ile-de-France was a watershed in interior design, a point from which ship designers looked forward rather than backwards. It led, in fact, to something called le style paquebot, or steamship style, and there's not a vessel afloat anywhere in the world since 1927 that does not owe something of her look to the Ile-de-France. Two ships most immediately part of the Ile-de-France's influence were the two German challengers of the North German Lloyd, the Bremen and Europa. The Bremen appeared first because the Europa sustained a fire during her fitting out and sank up to her strength deck, setting back construction by a year and a half. So it was left for the Bremen to wrest the blue ribbon away from the aging Mauretania in 1929. The competition dating back to 1907 had come full circle again with the Germans out in front. But the German hold on the blue ribbon lasted only a few years. In 1933, the Italian line fielded a new pair of champions, the Rex and the Conte di Savoia. Once again, the Conte di Savoia looked conventional enough from outside, but her interiors were startling. A bizarre combination of styles where El Morocco zebra-striped upholstery met Villa Borghese. It is worth recalling that even to the present day, ships designed for the North Atlantic are never allowed to look like ships. In order to comfort their passengers on this most dangerous ocean, it was the custom to trick up the interiors with as many columns, tapestries, wrought iron grills, paneling, any land-based appurtenances, all to convince vulnerable and often seasick passengers that they were not at sea at all, but spending a long weekend in an English country house or a provincial chateau, or even an Adirondack hunting lodge. This steamship poster, perhaps the most widely reproduced in the world, was commissioned by the French line in the 30s to publicize their new flagship. She was one of a kind. Neither the France, the Paris, nor even the Ile-de-France had anticipated her revolutionary good looks. The Normandy was the first of the 1,000-foot liners, of which only 4 have ever been built: the Normandy, the France, and the first 2 Queens. They were the apogee of shipbuilding bulk, so expensive that government subsidies were required to complete them. Conceived in the heady optimism of the late 20s before the crash, the Normandy and Queen Mary were both completed despite a depression that reduced passenger revenues alarmingly during the period of their construction. But the Normandy should be remembered less for her improbability or extravagance than her incredible design, a look that would have survived the 50s and 60s with ease. Atlantic liners have a normal life expectancy of 30 years. Their creators must devise a scheme of interior design that will seem fresh for 3 decades, as well as an exterior silhouette that will continue to attract a notoriously fickle clientele. The Norman's designers succeeded on both counts. Even from afar, she was a paradigm of style. In her fitting-out basin at Saint-Nazaire, she boasted a raked clipper stem, first on the Atlantic since the 19th century. 3 ovoid funnels, each with a dashing 10-degree rake, receded in height to convey a subtle impression of speed. The afterdecks had all the cosmetic perfection of a Busby Berkeley movie set. Imagine a coat of black lacquer spread over that teak, and one almost expected Ruby Keeler, Dick Powell, and a large chorus to materialize out of thin air. Between the funnels was a broad, uncluttered expanse of open deck, with all the ship's conventional sinews swept out of sight. This cleanness of design was in marked contrast to the identical space on the Mauretania of 30 years earlier, where a forest of guy wires, ventilators, blowers, and skylights obscures the vista. Below decks, the Normandy's interiors profited from a principle of construction pioneered on the Vaterland back in 1914. The uptakes, the chimneys, if you will, connecting boiler and funnel, were divided towards either side of the hull, permitting the designers to fashion a series of central public rooms amidships that led from one to the other in the tradition of Versailles. This simile is particularly appropriate in the Normandy's salle à manger, or dining room, a chamber exceeding Versailles' Hall of Mirrors in length. It too was sheathed in fireproof, maintenance-free glass, liberally gilded. The gastronomic indulgence permissible therein rivaled the architectural delights, and a corps of French line cooks posed here proudly on the Normandy's smoking room staircase contributed their incomparable skills. The dining room was achieved from the grand hall, the entrance concealed here by handsome bronze doors. The swimming pool was 100 feet long, a paradise of gold mosaic, complete with shelving beach for cautious bathers. A French line photographer has organized a platoon of models into an elaborate charade of gaiety. It's always amusing to separate contrived passengers from the genuine article, and I prefer to see the Normandy's pool filled with real passengers in mid-ocean. It was a moment, incidentally, in the evolution of bathing attire of a curiously inverted propriety, when women were experimenting with bare midriffs and gentlemen weren't quite sure. Those who came to watch were typical of the clients that seemed drawn to the Normandy. She attracted a kind of Fellini-esque haute monde, as sinister and mysterious an assemblage as had ever booked on one compelling ship before. Of course, she carried thousands of perfectly ordinary transatlantic travelers as well, but always, it seemed, with a handful of gangsters and eccentrics thrown in for good measure. The Grand Salon was similarly sheathed with an enormous glass mural, panels of which now fetch enormous sums at auction houses. The room was furnished with dozens of elaborate fauteuils upholstered in Aubusson tapestry. Adjoining it was a fumoir, or smoking room, a sober assemblage of traditional brown leather club chairs. The two contrasting spaces could be joined for special occasions into one vast chamber by the operation of electrical sliding doors. Aft, one ascended a staircase to the Normandy's extra-tariff restaurant called a grill, which served meals on request all day and as a nightclub late at night. Outside, the grill gave onto an elaborate esplanade, where first-class strollers were separated from the second by high-backed zigzag benches. In the base of the third dummy funnel, an elaborate kennel was equipped with a New York City hydrant as well as a Parisian lamppost. All this grandeur was ready to be unveiled to the public in May of 1935, when the Normandy set sail from her builders at Saint-Nazaire to her home port of Le Havre. It is interesting to see how cleverly the line of white paint along the Normandy's strength deck transcends the line of plating near the bow and rises up to a fine point, accentuating her clipper prow. On the bridge, over 100 feet wide, the helmsman stood on an ash grating, used traditionally on sailing vessels to keep his feet dry, even though on the Normandy he stood more than 70 feet above the nearest wave. At sea, the Normandy behaved refreshingly like any steamer. She was, in the words of one Annapolis observer, a stiff, snappy roller, returning to the vertical with the resiliency of a destroyer. Life on board offered all the traditional dividends of a crossing: tea in a promenade deck chair, a new play in the theatre, dancing in the gallery, and the devoted ministrations of a newly uniformed staff that numbered 1,200. Stewards on board ships eat on the run, and in the cruise mess the inward curve of the hull betrays its location up near the Normandy's bow. A large sea-going wine cellar contributed to the pleasures of that triumphant maiden voyage, the first time that a French vessel had ever won the coveted blue ribbon. Arriving in New York, she was also the first liner to use the super piers on West 50th Street, especially built to dock the 1,000-footers. This time, as opposed to the arrival of the Olympic back in 1911, the port of New York was ready. The Normandy tied up at Pier 88, the berth that would see her arrival and departure for the next 4 years, as well as her tragic destruction. This was the Normandy's great competitor of the mid-30s. For a long time, she was known only as John Brown Hull No. 534, and for a year during her construction, all work ceased. Cunard had a cash flow problem. Passenger revenues were down, and the yard was ordered closed. Flocks of Clydeside pigeons nested in the rusting girders of the uncompleted hull. But a government subsidy was passed in Parliament on condition that Cunard and White Star, the traditional British rivals, joined forces to complete the new ship. Work proceeded, and Cunard White Star flooded the press with awesome details. Remember how the Duchess of Roxburgh had driven through the funnels of the Mauretania in a motor car? The Queen Mary's funnels, it was reported, could accommodate 3 locomotives, or, if you preferred, Cunard's original ship, the Britannia. The choice of a name was delayed until the day of her launch. There is an apocryphal story that Lord Royden, a company director, while shooting grouse with King George V in Scotland, asked His Majesty if the new ship could be named after England's greatest queen. He had had Victoria in mind. His Majesty is supposed to have replied that he would ask her as soon as he went home to Balmoral for tea. The story is charming but untrue. It seems scarcely likely that a name ending in Cunard's IA would have been a tactful choice for those White Star members of the board. In any event, Her Majesty gave her consent, and on September 26, 1934, cut the launch cord that sent the new vessel down the ways. Her empty hull alone weighed as much as a completed Mauretania. Such was the friction between oak and pine that the ways burst into flame, and the fire department had to be summoned to extinguish the blaze. Her interiors were no more innovative than her profile, which was in fact nothing more than an enlarged Aquitania. Unkind critics called the Queen Mary's public rooms a riot of Leicester Square cinema. She was full of exotic veneers, cabins and corridors drummed and chattered with vibrating panels of wood. One of her proudest installation was Queen Mary's personal standard that occupied a glass case on the main staircase. In the first-class dining room, little illuminated models of both queens traversed this Atlantic mural keyed to the ship's crossing times. On the promenade deck, there was a nice touch of British elegance, a discreet notice indicating that 3 times around was a mile, and that the record for running it was held by Lord Burleigh, who ran, it was recorded, in full evening dress. Shortly after her maiden voyage, the Queen Mary took the blue ribbon from the Normandy. She was undeniably faster, although it must be reported that she had 40,000 more horsepower at her disposal. This aerial photograph shows the Normandy on trials off Brittany, and in the words of one Breton fisherman who survived her wake, she seemed to skim over the water like a gull. The same view of the Mary betrays incredible turbulence along the hull. Those 14 lozenge-shaped windows along the after end of the upper deck mark the location of the Veranda Grill, the Queen Mary's extra-tariff restaurant, which turned out to be such a popular rendezvous that it was decided to include its duplicate on board the Queen Elizabeth. Indeed, days after the Mary was launched, hull number 552 was laid down in her place. Cunard White Star's weekly service to New York would now be effected by 2 ships the size and speed of the Queen's. Each week, one would depart from Southampton and one from New York. Samuel Cunard's regular weekly service was a North Atlantic tradition. In 1840, it had required 4 ships, and in 1907, 3. Now it could be sustained with an irreducible minimum of 2. The Queen Elizabeth was launched by a new young queen in 1938. But before she was fitted out, another world war intervened, and the Elizabeth became a Clydeside liability, a tempting target for any Luftwaffe bomber that might penetrate that far north. Hence, in one of the most successful ruses of the war, the brand new ship sailed in secret for New York. She had had no engine trials or dry docking, and portions of her launch gear were still attached to the hull. Her entire complement consisted of a scratch crew from the Aquitania and a dozen technicians from John Brown's yard. She arrived unheralded one March morning in New York Harbor and tied up on the north side of Pier 90. For a fortnight, the 3 largest liners in the world were together. From left to right, the newly arrived Elizabeth, the Mary already in grey war paint, and the Normandy languishing at Pier 88, a New York Harbor captive since the outbreak of hostilities in September of 1939. Then the Queens were off on the urgent business of war. The luxurious fittings were put into storage in Halifax, and the 2 liners became troop ships, once again performing the same specialized function for which they had been designed, the transportation of large numbers of passengers at high speed. But these were incredible numbers. The record was nearly 17,000 carried on one crossing. During the summer, entire regiments slept on deck, and those lucky enough to have a berth below could only use it for half the day. Then a replacement took over. Continuous meals were served in a dining room filled with steel mess tables. GIs who had finished breakfast would start lining up again for lunch. The splendid proportions of the ship's main shopping square were awash with khaki. The two queens traveled alone, too fast for any convoy, and never followed the same route twice. It was rumored that Hitler promised any U-boat commander an Iron Cross and a fortune if he could sink one of the queens, but not one torpedo ever came close. Winston Churchill estimated that the work of the two ships shortened the war by a year. But the Normandy stayed put until December 8, 1941. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt ordered her seized and transformed into the troop ship USS Lafayette. The conversion contract was awarded to the Todd shipyard, and 3,000 dock workers swarmed over the ship. All work would be completed at Pier 88 before the ship was scheduled for dry docking in Boston. The Grand Salon, seen here during a peacetime gala, was turned into the main troop recreation compartment. Carpeting would come up and linoleum would go down. 4 decorative lamps, towering glass cascades, were to be cut down, their bases to serve as table supports. The glass was removed, and on the morning of February 9, 1942, a cutting crew began removing the steel tripods that remained. Their work was made harder because the day previous, 10,000 kapok life preservers had been delivered on board and dumped into the Grand Salon for stenciling before being distributed to cabins below. Kapok is an oil-impregnated, highly inflammable substance, and the life jackets were wrapped, 10 to a bundle, in tarred paper with a protective layer of new burlap. The first 3 tripods were removed successfully, but on the 4th and last one, the man charged with containing the sparks within an asbestos sheet moved away a fraction of a second too early, and a shower of white-hot metal fragments fell onto the burlap of the life preserver bales around the base. In a moment, it was alight. A ghastly kind of Marx Brothers comedy ensued. Men tried beating the flames out with coats and hats. Others threw burning bales aside, inadvertently spreading the flames. One man ran in with 2 buckets of water, tripped and fell. Another man ran out to the promenade deck and unreeled a new U.S. Navy hose, but its coupling was incompatible with the French hydrant. A man on the bridge tried summoning the fire department, but the special alarm button he pressed had been disconnected 2 weeks earlier. Unchecked, the fire spread to the walls. It was a bitterly cold morning. Fireboats, first on the scene, nosed into the ice of the slip between piers 88 and 90 and started pumping tons of water up to where they saw smoke. But their hoses couldn't penetrate to the Grand Salon, only through shattered promenade deck windows where the water was retained by blocked scuppers. Melted lead from electrical conduits had plugged the drains. The fire burned steadily, sending poisonous clouds of smoke over the city that by dusk had reached the far boundary of Suffolk County. The same smoke engulfed the engine room within 15 minutes, drawn down through ventilating trunks. The ship was evacuated, her vital systems inoperable. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Normandy had achieved what the Navy termed a safe list of 16 degrees. Fireboats continued their deadly barrage, pouring superfluous water aloft, some of which showered back into the harbor, but some of which stayed on board, adding tons of critical top weight. Several large ports, double doors really in the hull shell plating, remained open, dangerously near the waterline, but no attempt was made to close them as the ship continued her inexorable list. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the fire was out, and a photographer on board took a picture of the derelict interior up the smoking room staircase. On the bridge, the firewall had held, though badly charred, and the Normandy's wheel was still intact. When I was researching the only way to cross, I found the wheel in a New Jersey warehouse, bought it from the diver who had stolen it, and presented it to the South Street Seaport Museum in New York, where it is on display to this day. At midnight, the tide turned. 2.5 hours later, the Normandy rolled over in her slip, like a giant discarded bathtub toy. The Navy removed the armaments that had already been installed on the stern and then set about the work of refloating her. It cost $5 million and consumed 18 months of indescribable labor. Everything above the strength deck was cut away. This view was taken from the top of Pier 90 to the north. Every porthole, opening, and hatch below water was patched. Working in water so filthy that they could see nothing, divers divided up the hull into 16 watertight compartments, which were pumped dry in delicate sequence until finally, agonizingly slowly, the Normandy rolled upright. The pumping operation alone took 6 weeks, and when the job was complete, the hull, bearing the growth rings of her ascent from the harbor, was towed to Brooklyn and dry docking. It was already autumn of 1943, and the Navy decided that further renovation that late in the war was impractical. So she was scrapped, ending the life of the North Atlantic's most beautiful ship after only 70 voyages between Le Havre and New York. Had she survived the war, there is every reason to suppose that the Normandy would have remained in service as long as her famous Cunard White Star rival, the Queen Mary. When hostilities in Europe were over in the spring of 1945, one pre-war Atlantic liner changed hands. She was the Europa, only survivor of the record-breaking North German Lloyd duo of 1929. The Bremen had been sunk at her moorings by the RAF. The United States government presented the Europa to the French, some said as a replacement for the lost Normandy. She was delivered to Le Havre, where, after a severe Channel storm, she broke loose from her moorings and was rammed by the sunken bow of the Paris, which had burned and capsized at her pier in 1938. The Europa sank upright, harbor water lapping at her railings, just as she had after the fire during her fitting out in Germany years earlier. But she was salvaged, towed to Saint-Nazaire, and transformed by the French into the beloved Liberté. The Aquitania, the only four-stacker to have survived both world wars, returned to Gourock after her last trooping voyage, ready to resume service on the ocean for which she had been designed. In Southampton, both queens arrived home from the war. The Elizabeth was painted in company colors for the first time, and the inbound Mary already has her funnels restored to Cunard's red and black. Finally, the Queen Elizabeth had a proper maiden voyage. So profitable was that post-war service that Congress was persuaded to authorize funds for an American superliner as well. From the start of her construction in a dry dock at Newport News, she was known as the United States, the brainchild of William Francis Gibbs, Dean of American Naval Architects. The chance to build his own brand new ship had been a 30-year obsession with Gibbs, and given his head by Congress and the Navy, he designed a handsome, fast, if slightly Spartan ship. She was designed for almost instant conversion into a troop ship. Gibbs was terrified of fire on board and liked to claim that there was no wood anywhere on the United States save for chopping blocks and pianos. As it was, he pestered Louis Steinway for months to build him an aluminum piano, but relented when Steinway promised to douse a fireproof wooden one with gasoline to show that it wouldn't burn. This picture, publicizing one of the United States' famous chopping blocks, inadvertently reveals two additional wooden items, the handle of the knife the cook is using, as well as a small scrubbing brush on the porthole's ledge. She was incredibly fast. Trials off Jamestown assured Gibbs that his dream ship would take the blue ribbon with ease. Although no speed figures were released, a fine haze of mist along the waterline indicated that the United States had extraordinary reserves of power. Later, it was estimated that she could travel in excess of 40 land miles an hour. The ship first entered her home